Now, we talk a lot about crowdsourcing and Kickstarter on the program, and today we have a chance to speak to really one of the greats, Tim Schafer from Double Fine. He's the mind behind some classics like Grim Fandango and, of course, one of my favorite, Psychonauts. He's here today to talk Broken Age. That's his latest product. Now, we really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us.
Oh, thanks for having me, Andy.
Well, first off, how's it going with the Broken Age development?
Well, we just shipped the first half of the game, which is really exciting, and especially exciting because Kickstarter, I think, is still seen as kind of a yet-to-be-proven thing to a lot of people. Like, are these people going to live up to their promise of producing these games that we backed? And so it was nice to actually put out at least the first half of the game to show that we weren't kidding.
For those who, hear the name Broken Age, have no idea what it's about, what's the short pitch? What can you tell us about it?
Well, I mean, it started with just, I had no idea. I just wanted to make an adventure game like I used to make in the 90s, which we used to make back at LucasArts. And that was seen as no longer commercially viable anymore by publishers. You couldn't make one anymore. I couldn't get funding for it. And so we turned to Kickstarter and said we wanted to make an adventure game. We were surprised by the response we got. And we ended up making this game called Broken Age, which is two stories in one. A story about two kids about 14 years old. One's a girl named Vela and one's a boy named Shay. And Shay is being raised all by himself on a spaceship out in the middle of space and by a kind of mothering over computer. And Vela has been selected for a great honor in her town, which is actually to be sacrificed to the giant monster Mag Chothra in order to save her town from destruction. So one of those kind of stories.
Yeah, one of those kind of, classic stories that we hear so often. Well, I love, we talk about Kickstarter here a lot on VGS. You came to it initially, again, very bare bones. You didn't really have a lot in mind before you actually started. When, if you could share, did you get the idea for, I guess, the preliminary storyline that we now have for Broken Age?
Well, we tried to document. We're doing a documentary also, a video documentary about the making of the game. And on the first day, I sat down to write. I like to free write in a spiral notebook with a pen and just come up with ideas. And I was looking back through some old notebooks of old ideas I had, and I realized these two stories about Vel and Shay, even though they're so different, one being set in a spaceship and one in more of a pastoral setting, had these similar themes about kids coming of age and realizing that they had control or more power in their lives than they realized. They didn't have to abide by the prescripted lives that were decided for them by their either parents or their communities, and decided to kind of break out of that and then realize that there are these consequences that they have to deal with. It's all part of growing up. And so these two different stories had a lot of really similar themes, and they intertwined in interesting ways, I thought.
A big part of Kickstarter is, of course, making a game that is developed by the backers. Are there many instances where direct contributions from those who backed actually got into the final product, at least with Act 1 of what we've seen right now?
Yeah, we had when I was just starting out from scratch, I was like, let's think of all. I went to our forums, which is where we talk to our backers, and I said, let's talk about all the crazy, fun locations you could have in the game, because you could really have any location at all. We got so many contributions, but one of them stood out. It was a town made of sandcastles, where everyone lived in sandcastles, and so that's in the game, turned into a town called Shell Mound. And there's those kind of contributions, but there's also the way that we just kind of take a pulse of our backers by reading their comments in the forums, and we'll put up a piece of concept art, like our concept art of Vela, our main character, and they saw that iteration of her going through all her different character design stages. And also after we shipped to the backers, we let them have the beta of the game before anyone else. And some people didn't like the way the inventory worked. They liked to click twice instead of clicking and dragging. And so we changed that before we released the final game to make it so you could actually click and click. And it was something that the PC gamers among our backers really appreciated. So they've definitely had an impact on the game. Plus, just the encouragement. I mean, they've always been such a vocal and passionate group that just encourages us to go forward, and that really helps when you're in the middle of a long project, for sure.
How exactly do you, I guess, market and package a game that is like this, that is very much a point-and-click game, when we're dealing with so many big AAA titles that usually take up so many hours that gamers only have to play? How do you compete, I guess?
Well, I mean, it's actually easy to stand out in the market where a lot of the AAA games tend to look the same and have very similar themes, I think. And in the indie game community, you definitely see a lot more variety and a lot more games that look like nothing you've ever seen before. And I think with a small company like ours, we don't have a big marketing budget, so we do a lot of PR, we do a lot of interviews, and we do a lot of relying on our community, because when you get these backers, like we had 90,000 backers, you get 90,000 people who are really kind of interested in your game, and they become these advocates for you, and they go out and talk about your game, and when even when an article comes out that has factual errors in it, they will make comments in the comment section and correct those errors. So it's like you have a huge kind of PR group working for you.
Well, we'll be very careful to make sure everything is absolutely correct.
Yeah, you better watch out, or the backers will get you.
I don't want that to happen. What really drew to these sort of games, this style of gameplay, this style of game making, so many years ago? Why did you come into this industry and say, I want to make games that are like this? And you've stuck with that sort of method of game making. So, why is that so appealing to you?
Well, I mean, I've always loved video games, and I've always loved writing. Like, I always took creative writing classes in college. I was a computer science major, but I also took a lot of English and writing classes. And I've just always liked that kind of story approach to creating a world for players that makes them feel like it's a place they want to go to. Just that's the ultimate goal for me, is to make a fantasy world that people miss when they're not in it, and they can't wait to go back into that world and talk to those characters again, because it feels real to them. And so I think things that involve story and characters have always appealed to me. And there's all different kinds of games, and I enjoy all different kinds of games, but I think story can always help you motivate the player to want to pull through. Like when the gameplay gets really hard, there's some people will want to beat that just for the pleasure of beating it, of course, but also there's that feeling of like wanting to see the resolution to the story they're really invested in.
For those fans of some of your old school work, are we going to have in at least Act 2, the continuation of this Kickstarter, a lot of homages to those previous great works that you made so long ago?
Maybe those tend to sneak out when I'm writing dialogue late at night by myself. I might either accidentally or on purpose make a reference to an old game, because sometimes I'm just forgetting that I made a joke before, and then someone will say, what a great reference to an old game, and I'm like, that's right, it was a perfect reference I made. Really, I'm just recycling my old material. But hopefully there are a lot of little winks and nods and little Easter eggs. I think in Act 1 you can see the smelling salts from Psychonauts and little touches like that I think people like to find.
One of my favorite things about, I think, most of the games that you've made is the very unique art direction and art style. I absolutely adore it. Who's responsible, I guess? I imagine it's never one mind, but can you talk a little bit about the development and changes to that art style that has been prominent in every single game that you've made? You can kind of tell, at least, that this is a Tim Schafer sort of game. So I'd love to know a little more about that.
Well, I mean, I think the common thread is just working with great artists, all through my career. I just really value having really creative artists on the project. Since my earlier days, I've always worked with Peter Chan, who's been a lead artist or a contributing artist on all my games. And this time around, I really wanted to have a game where Nathan Stapley, one of our other longtime collaborators, an artist who does great fine art and all kinds of cartoon art, he can really stand out in this game and put his art front and center, because that's what you get with a 2D adventure game, is you get the ability for an artist to paint a background and have it actually be the final asset in a game, instead of just a piece of concept art that goes through a lot of iteration and becoming a 3D piece of art, for example. But when the project got kickstarted, so overfunded, it sounds like a problem when you put it that way. Oh, you're overfunded, which it can be for sure. But when our scope increased, we had a lot more environments to make, and so it couldn't be just Nathan drawing everything for himself. So we brought on a lot of other great artists, including our art director Lee Petty and Scott Campbell, and a whole team of artists worked on it. And the mission was always to keep it as true to Nathan's style as we could.
You talked about before, Act 1 is already out. How has the reception been from the fans and critically? How is this really molded where you're going to take Act 2?
It was a big relief when we released it, and we got great reviews and good response from our backers, and so that allowed us to feel good about continuing on with Act Two. I mean, I think some people with adventure games it's funny because no matter how long or hard you think you make it, as soon as you release it, someone beats it right away and says that's too easy. So hopefully they'll be pleased with Act Two because I'm sure Act Two should be harder than Act One. That just makes logical sense, doesn't it?
You'd hope so, right? Since this is a Kickstarter game and you want to make sure that there is a lot of reference from the backers, I'd love to know, since you are releasing these games in Act 1 and Act 2, how much of different suggestions and contributions from backers based on Act 1 will influence Act 2? And, what's the line between sticking to that planned narrative path and then making sure that backers feel like they're a part of the process?
Well, I think backers want to feel part of the process, but they also are trusting me to do a good job, hopefully using the same, techniques I maybe used before in previous games. So hopefully I don't think, basically I can't just say, well, the backers made me do it. They made me do a zombie game, because so I still have to use my best judgment, trust instincts when possible. And so definitely the main plot of the game was already set in my head and is not going to be changed from any reaction to the backers. But the interesting that comes up is that backers have questions that I never thought of, like, is this character secretly thinking this, or is this character motivated by this? And I may not have thought of that when I was writing Act 1, so I want to maybe add a few twists here and there just so that person is satisfied. Even if they don't get the ending they thought maybe was happening, at least that possibility that ending has been addressed.
And you've just essentially given a fan of adventure games, a dream that they've always had, that they got to play a game and have a question for it and actually influence Act 2. So that's absolutely amazing, something you obviously couldn't do in any other sort of development of a game, because Kickstarter is very unique in that way, right?
Yeah, and it might not be direct, like it might not be we use exactly the suggestion, but it's more like us just talking to them every day and hearing where they're coming from. It's just I can't help it, but I got 90,000 people in my head every day when I'm working, and I'm thinking about them all the time. So it's a really special thing you get when you get with Kickstarter, which is you don't just get a bunch of money, and the money is nice, but you also get this huge pep squad, it's just like it's just a wave of love and support and positive vibes coming from all these people who are supporting you, and that's super important when you're trying to do something long-term, big-scale production, because you can get kind of bogged down and discouraged even on the best projects. So having the backers and their support has been super critical.
So let's go back, a couple years ago before you announced this Kickstarter project. What brought you to that decision to kind of adopt this alternative model of making games? Because we look at that time and there weren't a lot of games, or any kind of major games that were taking that route. And now, 2014, there are tons that have gone through this process or going through it. And in a lot of ways, you guys were a trailblazer in that way. So yeah, how exactly did that come about?
Kind of accidental trope. I'd been approached a while back from one of the people at Kickstarter, Andy Bio. He said, "Hey, you guys should Kickstarter a game." And I said, "What's Kickstarter?" And I asked some people what Kickstarter was, and one of our business guys said, "Well, that's this thing that some people use to crowdfund, art projects, and you can get like $5,000 from it, but really there's no way you could ever fund a whole project." And I was like, "Okay, never mind." So we didn't do it. And then a year later, the guys from Two Player Productions, a documentary crew who had done a documentary about Minecraft, they had crowdfunded that documentary. And they came to us and said, "We want to do a documentary about you guys next, and we want to crowdfund it." And we're like, "That's great, but we should also crowdfund the game too, so that we have complete ownership over it, and we don't have to get approval for any footage we use when we make the documentary." Because I thought making a documentary is a great idea about games, because I want to show everything, the good and the bad and the ugly, and you don't want to have to go to a publisher and give permission for all of that, because they don't want you to show when you cut stuff from the game or when you have a uncomfortable conversation about the budget or something like that. I wanted to show everything. So we said, yeah, let's start the game. And that's when I started thinking about what should we kickstart. And that old kind of recurring thing that had been happening to me, where people said, "We want you to make an adventure game." And I'd buy one copy, And that happened to me a lot, and I was like, well, yeah, I think that's, how many people are there out there who would buy one copy? If there only was some way of knowing that in advance, and then all of a sudden, Kickstarter shows up and does that exact same thing. It lets you know in advance how many people would buy a copy.
Mm-hmm. Again,
But
we're
it's
talking
different than just pre-selling your game. You're not just pre-selling your game. Kickstarter is different. It's people are patronizing the arts. They're supporting a creative person who they want to see make something. So it's really different than people pre-selling a game. And I think that's kind of a common misconception among, especially the games community.
Mm-hmm. Again, talking to Tim Schafer from Double Fine, all about Broken Age and Kickstarter. You're a couple years in, since it was initially funded. There was a huge boom. You guys got way more money than you originally planned for. Were you able to stick with that development plan, or were some of those stretch goals gotten more and more difficult to grasp onto? Like, have the plan that you guys have had with the money you had, were you able to stick with that, or were some difficulties when you have to adopt a lot of those principles that maybe developers don't always need to consider?
We didn't even have a plan when we started. So we were chasing, no one even said anything about the concept of stretch goals. When we started, we just started, people were asking us, what are you going to do with the extra money? And we just started saying, okay, we're going to have all different languages, and we're going to have full voice, and we're going to have an art book, and we're going to do T-shirts. We kept saying these things, like, God, we got to figure out ways to spend this money. And that's different than, in the very beginning, it just seems like so much money, $3 million, $3.5 million. How would you ever spend that? And then after a while goes by, like, games are very expensive to make, and so luckily we were very conscious with planning our costs in advance as far as our rewards go, because that's a big gotcha with Kickstarter projects. Some people don't calculate how much it's going to cost them just to mail T-shirts to people. That can, our rewards I think cost us like $200,000 just in shipping. Because we got to send art books to people and all this stuff. So luckily it was planned in advance. Our producer, and our team worked to plan all that, and that has worked out fine. But we with our project, we just started getting really involved in it, and we realized that we really felt good enough about it to make a big bet on it. So we put a bunch of our own money into it, and we didn't have that money when we started the Kickstarter. But since we were doing more and more independent publishing, we actually got to have some money that we could invest in our own project, and that's what we ended up doing with Broken Age.
Well, you're a couple years in now, and looking back, are there any big changes that you would make? First 2 years, I believe, since the Kickstarter was achieved. Yeah, with hindsight now, anything that you would change?
It's really hard to say because I really am happy with how the game turned out, and we definitely had our ups and downs and scary moments, but in the end, it turned out to be a game that we're really proud of. So I would hate to do anything that would mess with that, and I wouldn't trade in our backers for the world. So if anything, if I'm trying to think of one example of something that we would do differently, a lot of it has to do with how to handle PR and how to handle this discrepancy between. We have a private backer forum, and so some information is private only to the backers, and then there's some information we share with everybody. So that has kind of surprised us sometimes because we think everybody knows things, and it turns out they don't all know about it, and it becomes a news item when we thought everybody knew about it for months. So on our second Kickstarter, we've had things be more open. So I guess even more transparency is the only change I would make, and let people see, even non-backers see a lot of the inner workings of the game, like we're doing on Massive Chalice.
I knew there was
Kickstarter.
Yeah, absolutely. I knew there was a little bit of, I would say, controversy perhaps with an issue like that, where the funding method of separating the title into acts and then having one available to purchase beforehand. I remember, I think it was last year, a big explosion saying, they don't know what they're doing with Kickstarter. Now that you've gone through this process, that the first act is out, you've got the revenue from that, and you're continuing to do so. Has that gone according to plan, and were you able to, I guess, respond to that criticism a way to make people understand that, this wasn't just a cash grab?
Yeah, that was a very strange thing when that happened. That's kind of what I was talking about, when I was talking about how our backers understood what was going on, but a lot of people who weren't our backers and were not as informed on our documentary or watching the documentary didn't really understand what was going on. So there was this idea that the company was out of money, or that we wanted to double dip and go back to the backers for more money, which we weren't doing any of that. We were just investing our own money in it and releasing it in two parts. And that's one thing we would do differently, maybe how we announce that, because it's a funny thing because it's something that happens on almost every project, which is that they make their budget and their schedule, and then halfway through they now re-examine, they make a bunch of cuts, and then they change their ship date, and it happens on every single project. It's just that usually those projects aren't announced yet, and you haven't even heard about them yet, and it's just that people had a lot more transparency in our projects than they thought. We were the first project to ever adjust the scope of their game along the way.
When in reality, like you said, it happens all the time, sort of thing.
Right, and we were just trying to make a better game. Let's put a little more money into this and make it even better. So it was kind of a big surprise to have people react to that negatively, and I can see where that comes from. And but a lot of it is, I feel there's definitely a lot of mistrust about Kickstarter, because I think to some people it just seems like somebody's getting free money. And it's a Ponzi scheme. Like, you're going to, that I've got all this money, I'm going to go buy a boat with it and run off. And I guess there is that risk to it. And there definitely have been some projects that have gone not the way that people thought. And that's why Kickstarter added that whole section of risks, that every project has, to let people know you're not buying a game off Amazon when you back a Kickstarter project. You're putting your faith in an artist to make something, and things go sometimes differently than planned. And I think a lot of people are just kind of waiting for bad news about Kickstarter because they resent it, which is a crazy thing. But I hope that will, as projects like Broken Age and Massive Chalice and Brian Fargo's game and all those other games that have been Kickstarted come out, people will realize that it's not a scam, that it's actually a great way for people to make things happen that wouldn't happen without the backers.
You alluded to it there. Tell us more, of course, about Massive Chalice as well, your other Kickstarter project.
Yeah, Brad Muir, who's been, we've been pitching games for, he's one of our talented project leaders here. He had this idea for a game, and we had just been pitching. He had a previous idea that we had pitched for a whole year. We'd taken it on this tour and shown every single publisher, and they're like, we love it except for this or that, and it just wasn't going anywhere. And then he had this other idea, and instead of putting it through that again, I was like, let's go to Kickstarter. And there's a lot of worry, like, can you do two Kickstarter projects? But we felt that it was totally a great way to fund a project, and we went back there, and it was a big success. And now we're making Massive Chalice, and even more transparently than we were making Broken Age.
Excellent. So I love talking to the developers who are adopting this new way of making games to have that transparency. And usually the biggest issue is exactly the one that you've said, that they have to adopt the role of being PR people. And for, I guess, a lot of development firms, that's not what they traditionally do. But since you initially started the, Broken Age, there have been a lot more games that have taken this route. Do you see this method of crowdsourcing just getting more and more popular? Are we going to hit a plateau? And, because I think there is a little bit of a resurgence of these great indie titles, is this going to perhaps even overtake a more traditional method of making games, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's self-correcting. Kickstarter, if projects that shouldn't be on Kickstarter get on Kickstarter, they won't get funded. So I think if there is a point where there's ever too many of them, the Kickstarter itself, it just will self-regulate because people won't back them. They'll hit their limit. But I think I think there's a lot of potential for a lot more games to be Kickstarted, and that once we have a few more success stories like ours, it'll become, people will be less skeptical about it, and it'll be seen as a really valuable thing because it provides a greater variety of games that would have been there in the past. And as to the question of whether they overtake, like AAA games, I really think they coexist. Indie games and AAA games can coexist, and I don't think Kickstarter is going to destroy the games industry any more than the Sundance Film Festival will destroy the movie industry, right? Because when something like Sundance came along and gave higher visibility to a lot of indie movies, it just added variety and diversity to the art form, and I think it was really healthy for the movie industry. It didn't get rid of Spider-Man and Batman and all those other movies. It just provided even more alternatives to people have when they went to the movie theater, and I think indie games do that too. They just provide much more alternatives to the games that people still love to play. They still want to go play a multi-million-dollar shooter sometimes, and then sometimes they want to play something like Broken Age.
I think you hit the nail on the head right there. I just love to think of the idea of the video game industry and where it's moving in comparison to other genres. You've talked about this beforehand. video games are really good simulators for shooting or other things like that, but we don't really have, the comedy rom-coms, if you will, for video games sort of thing. How do we get to that point where we do have that level of variety in an industry, in a medium like video games in comparison to other forms of entertainment that we consume? How do we do that? Because I think a lot of the games that you make try to do that in really interesting ways. So, yeah, I'd love to know a little more on your opinion on that.
Well, I think it's strange, but I think the thing that leads to a lot more artistic diversity is somewhat of a different funding diversity. Because in the old model where you had to go to a gatekeeper who was sitting by a giant pile of money and convince them that they were going to make a lot of money with your idea, that led to a lot of risk mitigation and a lot of things that were not necessarily creative concerns, but just more concerns about how you weren't going to lose their money. And so you would sand off all the rough edges of your idea, and if anything was going to alienate anyone or hadn't been proven to be successful in the past, you wouldn't do it. So that leads to a certain type of game, which is like licensed games and sequels and more safe bets because you're betting millions and millions of dollars. But I think with things like smaller indie games or games being funded by people just not paying themselves because they just got out of school or they're just financially able to do that, or with angel investors, or with things like Kickstarter, you have an ability for a risky idea to get funded, And I think that's a huge, huge step because risky ideas are, they don't always work out, but they're, I think, always where, the new and inspiring ideas come from. And I think so. As we uncovered this greater diversity of funding models, people will be willing to take risks on things because they're not risking $30 million of publicly held companies' funds.
Is this the best time ever for video games? Or are we looking back at the golden days of yesteryear? What do you think?
Well, it's a toss-up between this and the Dreamcast. I think that was the golden days. Somewhere around there.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Again, Broken Age Act 1, it's in stores right now. If you're listening at home, how can gamers get this game and play it? And I know there is a bit of a star-studded cast. Who are some of the voices they might recognize if they do download this game and get a chance to play it?
Yeah, we have our friend from Brutal Legend, Jack Black, has come back to play a role. And we have Will Wheaton and Penn Ward, the creator of Adventure Time. And we also have Elijah Wood, who turns out to be a huge adventure game fan. And I got a conversation going with him on Twitter, and he offered him a part and he plays Shay, our lonely astronaut boy. And he did a great job with that.
So there you go, folks. You start conversations on Twitter, eventually, you'll have celebrities in your game. Absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much.
Guaranteed, 100% guaranteed.
That 100% guarantee from Tim Schafer.
Go to Twitter right now and ask every celebrity to be in your game.
It'll happen.
Money in the bank.
There you go, money in the bank.
Go wrong.
Thank you so much, sir, for taking the time again. Make sure you pick up Broken Age and, of course, a Massive Chalice. Again, you can find those online. All the links will be available at 640toronto.com/VGS. Thank you so much, sir, for taking the time.
Thanks. Great having you.